This lesson will cover using a for each loop. The topics include: what is a for each loop? Why would you use a for each loop instead of the other types of loops discussed? How can you access keys and values in a for each loop? And how would a for each loop be used in a website? Moving now to our code example. In this example, we are generating a survey using the same information as was presented in a previous lesson, which demonstrated the while and the do while. You'll notice on line 5, we have an array of arrays, where the key represents the label, and the array associated with the key represents options for that particular label. On lines 12 and 13, we have styling information. On line 15, you see an example of a for each loop, where we are accessing both the key and the value. The syntax is as follows: the word for each, followed by a space, which is optional. In parentheses, we do not have an expression, you'll notice. There's no comparison expression here. Instead, we have the array, which is to be iterated through, the word as. Following that, we have key association indicator, which is equal, greater than, and value. What this does then is inside the loop, which is opened as usual by the opening bracket, it's closed by the closing bracket on line 25. Inside the loop, we have access to each element of the array each time we go through the loop. The purpose of the for each loop is to iterate through an array. This is also referred to as looping through the array, and the difference between for each and other commands is that it loops through every element of the array in order, one at a time, until it reaches the end. This is advantageous if you need to go through an entire array. It's not advantageous, however, if there are certain conditions which would cause you to want to stop the processing, in which case you would consider one of the other types of loops, for loop, while loop, or do while. On line 19, we have an example of the for each loop, where we are only accessing the value part rather than the key. So on line 19, we have the for each command, space, which is optional, in parentheses, the array, the word as, and then the item, which represents the value, but not the key. Again, going back to our array, you'll notice that it is an array of arrays, or a multi-dimensional array, where we have key value. In this case, the key is a label, the value is itself an array. On line 16, we echo a div tag. On line 17, we echo the key. So we will see how will you arrive, your gender, preferred housing, and how many in the family. On line 18, we are representing the key by replacing the spaces with underscores in order to form a form tag, which will be used with a radio button, which is in the inner loop on line 21. Let's go ahead now and move over to the browser and have a look at the result. So you can see we have the same form that you saw in another lesson using while and do while. However, in this case, we're using the for each loop. So here's the outer loop here, the 4 tags, and the inner loop goes through the inner array where we have a series of radio buttons, which allows the user to select their options. So again, gender, male, female, radio buttons, preferred housing, flat, shared room, apartment, and how many in the family. So again, using radio buttons. So going back to the code one more time, again, the outer loop shows the key. In this case, the key represents the label. The inner loop goes through the inner array, one at a time, producing radio buttons with the tag. The tag is produced from the key, replacing the space with underscore, and making it all lowercase using stir to lower. Now, let's go back to the browser and have a look at the source. So as you can see, here's our outer div tag, our label, styling information, and then our radio button. Notice the radio button matches the key, all lowercase with underscores. We're using the square bracket syntax, which is explained in another lesson. In review, what is a for each loop? A for each loop is used to scan or iterate through an array from beginning to end. Why would you use a for each loop instead of the other types of loops? The for-each loops are designed specifically to be used with arrays. The other loops are useful, but they're more generic. Also, other loops are used if you do not wish to iterate through the entire length of the array. How can you access keys and values in a for-each loop? The syntax is for each array as key association indicator value. The association indicator is the equal sign followed by the greater than sign. You can also represent this as array as value without the key. You open up the block with the opening bracket and close it with the closing bracket. You can then have one or more commands to be executed inside the loop. Each command must be terminated with a semicolon. How would a for-each loop be used in a website? You would use this, for example, to render rows of data, to iterate through an array, to produce a drop-down select box or a series of radio buttons or checkboxes. This concludes our discussion of using a for-each loop.